So with great respect, I welcome everyone to today's panel discussion titled Migration, the Cultural Aspect, where we would discuss facing the extreme challenge of migration in the coming decades of the European Union, where Europe can create a sustainable system of migration instead of forced migration. This is going to be one of the questions our guest will try to answer today. So let me introduce again our participants of today's discussion. Dr. Ralph Schoellhammer, Assistant Professor at Webster University, Vienna, Calum Nicholson, MCC Research Fellow here at MCC, of course, and Charlie Peter, GB News investigative reporter, journalist. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and participating in this panel discussion. So without further ado, I would like to start with the first question today, because from time to time it arises that the management of migration in Europe should be left to the member states instead of the European Union. To what extent do they share this position? What do you think?
With me? Well, I mean, good morning, afternoon. Well, I mean, from my point of view, I don't think the question is so much about whether the EU or member states ought to or indeed do have more authority. I think it's very difficult to disaggregate the two from each other. But I think the thing we often forget about when we think about immigration into Europe and this notion of fortress Europe is that it's really dependent on the EU's relationship with its neighboring states. It could be Libya, it could be Belarus, it could be the Balkans, Morocco, and the extent to which Europe actually has control of its own migration circumstance, I suppose, in terms of inward migration, we can have the best collaboration within the Union, and every country can have a very good policy in relation to their specific circumstance, and it's worth noting that every country has its own specific circumstance. Hungary is Britain's no longer part of the EU, an island surrounded by water, Hungary, an island surrounded by land. I mean, very different circumstances. But I think that it's, at the end of the day, if we don't have good relationships with neighboring states, then we're going to have all sorts of issues. For example, in the 2000s, Italy had, or indeed the EU had, bilateral agreements with, say, Libya. And what Libya did was the Italians funded detention camps in Libya. They funded flights for people to return to Libya. And they also had joint patrols with the Libyans. But when Gaddafi fell, and I should say, sorry, they also had the same with the Tunisians. And when both those dictators fell, it changed everything. And then and migration since has become a key element in negotiations with those countries. So I may be slightly dodging your question a bit, but it's more to say that I don't really think the issue with migration is about what's the best form of internal collaboration. It's the end of the day, it's the relationship with people outside the Union that really is of most consequence.
I think also internal collaboration is important insofar as an immigration system, if it's held by multiple states, is only as strong as its weakest link. And when you have a situation, as we do in Europe, whereby you have more restrictionist countries like Italy, Hungary, and Greece, they are facing a crisis whereby migration into the continent is incentivized by weaker links such as Germany and indeed former members like Britain. If you generate an incentive for people to travel to Europe because they know that they will get a good deal somewhere, then countries trying to resist that will continue to face those problems. And I think immigration is it is the most democratic of all functions of the state, because it's about the protection of the demos at its very core. So national sovereignty and the ability to choose that policy for yourself, I think, is absolutely vital. And that's why I'm very grateful to be British and now having recovered that capacity. But I think that for many European countries, that power is lacking. And so I think this is an inevitability of the European project, where you have so many competing incentives and desires, and fundamentally it won't necessarily work.
I mean, I think one of the main reasons why you can't have a pan-European solution to the problem is because there is no agreement among Europeans what the problem actually is. And if you look, the Western European approach to migration is a moral question, and the Eastern approach to migration is more a political question. And I think this is one of the big issues that everybody somehow feels, but nobody wants to talk about. And we see this, I'm sure, something we're going to touch upon when you look at problems with migration, right? It's migration from very specific parts. It's migration with very specific characteristics. So nobody's really thinking about even when we use the term migration, nobody thinks about the neurosurgeon who just graduated from Harvard who wants to go to Germany, right? This is kind of, we just take this umbrella term migration, and particularly in a political debate, it is very much avoided to kind of drill deeper what kind of migration we mean. So, for example, we talk about the 2015 migration crisis, but what was it exactly, right? Were all the people who came, were they all from Syria, right? Again, if you drill deeper, many people who came and had asylum claims, even, and this was made quite public also by the UNHCR, right, is that they didn't really have any ground to stand on. But there was this feeling that there is a moral obligation for Western Europeans, very often kind of, connected to this idea as atonement for the sins of the past. The German Left Party, for example, is now having as its main candidate for a European election somebody who has been very much an activist in the area of migration and getting people to Europe. And I think that's one of the major issues. There is no agreement among Europeans what kind of migration we're talking about, whether it's a political problem, an economic problem, or a moral problem. And I think if there is no agreement on the issue, then it's very, very hard to come to a shared solution.
Of course. Thank you.
Can I just throw something on? Well, one thing you mentioned about activists who are, one of the issues, so I have a background partly in what's loosely termed migration studies, which I don't think is a particularly real topic, honestly, but I did study it. And but it's interesting, if you study something like migration studies, it's amazing how many scholars in it are basically activists first and scholars second. And it's really very difficult to find information on migration that doesn't have a set of preconceptions built into it. So for instance, a lot of migration scholarship is saying, has a view of migration as a purely economic phenomena, and any sense of a changing culture, which is not easily quantifiable, is excluded from the analysis. In kind of similar, as a strange analogy, to the way the entire of science is based on the exclusion of consciousness. Like we exclude the cultural aspect in order to analyze, and that's almost by negation is an activist thing to have done. And so I think we have to be very conscious with a lot of migration statistics and academic analysis. The academic analysis seems to be, rigorous and objective and peer-reviewed, but it is, in my experience, extremely activist area of scholarship. It doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but I think it's more political than sometimes it would acknowledge.
So, of course, mass immigration can break up the welfare society, but also it can be doubtable. But a best example or a good example could be Sweden. Explosions, shootings, polar society. And after decades, however, there seems to be a turning point. There as well, long after the attitudinal and political change that occurred in the Scandinavian countries. Are the Swedes late with the tightening aspects and procedure they are trying to do?
It's never too late to act, and I think in politics, despair is a sin. And if you give up on anything, then you should move along and wait for somebody else to act for you. But I think on the first part of the question, the link between social solidarity and immigration, and the decline of social solidarity in particular, is undoubtedly the case. And I think this is a major issue in Sweden. I mean, I was born in Sweden, and I care very deeply about the country, and I go back regularly. And watching previously peaceful neighborhoods go from the calmness and serenity of Swedish civilization into one of a decline of trust and a reduction in people willing to support their fellow neighbor is linked entirely, or very strongly, to immigration. I mean, we've seen a ginormous rise in some of the shootings you referred to. There were just a handful, 25 in 2015. In 2021, there were well over 300 per year. And of those since 2017 arrested on gun charges, 85% had at least one parent born abroad. This is an imported problem. But again, despair is a sin in politics, and it's never too late to act. And as we're seeing the slow Swedish reaction, which is now reaching a precipice, I think it's long overdue and will inspire, I expect, similar reactions in other countries facing similar issues.
I mean, something that adds on to this is, which we should not forget, basically since the late 80s, in some countries a little bit earlier, Western Europeans made very clear that they want the limit on migration. The same in the United States. So kind of the people very soon voiced their discontent with European migration, or Western in this case, Western European migration policies, but the political class didn't listen. And what then happened is you had an entire political movement basically emerging around the sole topic of migration. I mean, we tend to forget this, but if for those of you who remember, in 2016, I mean, the campaign start of Donald Trump, his famous slogan was "Build the Wall," right? It was basically run originally on the issue of migration and then moved into other topics. The same in Europe, right? The Freedom Party in Austria, the Sweden Democrats, Pim Fortuyn in, I hope I pronounced this correctly, in the Netherlands before he was assassinated, right? All these parties kind of basically built their political fortunes on the topic of migration, and very often the argument was that these political parties have kind of created the problem, but I don't think that's the case. It was a reaction to a problem that obviously was something that was very important to the population, that the traditional parties were not willing to touch. And this brings me back to what I said before, because it was not seen as a political issue, but as a moral issue. So there was the idea that it's a moral obligation as atonement for colonialism or as an atonement for imperialism, whatever you want to call it, right, that one can simply not take a harsh stance on immigration. Of course, then it was only a matter of time until you had political movements that really came out of nowhere. Like the Freedom Party in Austria was a fringe party until they completely dedicated themselves to the matter of migration, and they surged from 5, 6, 7% to 29%. So this was not a minor issue, but the major parties, I would argue even today, still refuse to touch the topic, and it then culminated in 2016 in many ways with the election of Donald Trump. And I think this is again one of those issues. It's not that the problems with certain kinds of migration have just emerged now, right? I think for many people who lived in affected areas, I guess Malmö in Sweden would be one example, they have been living through this for a long time, but I think it was to a large extent the political powers that were afraid of touching that topic.
Well, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, you know, I don't think it's so much that the Swedes are late to it. I mean, I'm not sure how we'd measure late, but they've come to it now, that's for sure. But I do think, just to pull back from it a bit, when we think about migration, we often think of migration as something that we can separate out analytically and indeed politically from other issues. But of course, migration is a phenomena that's caught up with the entire broader political economic context we're living in. Migration goes up and down with the business cycle. When there's a depression, migration falls off. When the economy is good, migration is driven. Why? Because of demand for labor and opportunity and so on. And so I think actually in terms of dealing with any issue, any social issue, sometimes I think we spend too much time focusing on the symptoms. But you know, one of the big dangers in history when we had in the context of medicine is that we'd not treat disease as well because we'd look at the symptom as opposed to the pathology. And I feel sometimes we're still medieval in how we look at societal problems. We still confuse symptom and pathology quite a lot. At the end of the day, the broader context in which we're seeing the type of migration we're seeing is, you know, a very capitalist culture or a society that's based around perpetual economic growth as essential imperative. Growth required demographic growth for 150 years. And as all our societies have begun to tail off, we need to fill the gap somehow. And so is migration kind of an effect or a cause of the problems? I'm not saying migration or cultural sort of conflict in some ways is not a problem, but I'm saying the context in which that is even there is much deeper.
I mean, I might slightly respectfully push back a little bit on this. I think that's an important point. Although if we look at migration into Europe, I would argue kind of it has almost been, it has been a very clear trend line in many cases, I would argue, independently of the economic fortunes in said countries. And even if we look at it, right, because I think the argument is an important and the correct one, but given the structure of the German, for example, or the Western European welfare state, and if we look at the numbers when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to recipients of welfare, right, very often certain migrant groups are overrepresented compared to other groups. Again, this is, I want to say, I don't mean this as a personal attack on these groups, but this is simply what the statistics show, right? The argument, as is also made in Germany, we need migration, for example, to finance the welfare state. Well, that's not happening, right? Currently, the welfare state is financing migration, but not the other way around. When it comes to certain groups, right? Again, you don't have that problem, for example, in Germany with migrants from Iran. You don't have that problem with migrants from Vietnam. You don't have that problem with migrants from other areas of Southeast Asia. But with immigration from the Near Middle East, from parts of Central Asia, you have that issue. And so far, no answer has been found. And I think that is something, again, where everybody shies away to talk about because it has this moral connotation. But from a purely political, economic viewpoint, that kind of migration is neither beneficial to the German economy, nor to the German state, nor to the German, let's say, call it political cohesion. Again, I think this is just facing the facts. And then, of course, we have to draw our own conclusions from it.
This experience is true in Britain as well. We have had a flat line of economic quality since 2008. Living wages, real wages, have been stagnant for the best part of 2 decades now, and immigration is at an all-time high. And it seems the economic strategy is to plug the gaps left by a failure to improve productivity elsewhere by importing more and more people who, generally speaking, as Ralph has alluded to, and as expressed very clearly, in fact, do not provide the economic benefits that the state is hunting when it conducts that kind of immigration. And if we drill down further as well, many of these groups, particularly from South Asia in the British experience, are more clannish than the native population, and many European neighbours who in previous years would come to Britain more regularly. And this means that immigration begets more immigration. If you have an anchor or a bridgehead migrant in Britain, many more can come over by virtue of our very generous laws when it comes to family reunion. And so being careful about the source of migration is vital for that reason.
I think, and in my opinion, France can pose a great example where migration can pose a lot of societal issues. So in connection with the latest events in France, the question arises as to whether there's an encouraging future for young third-generation migrants who have been unable to break out of the periphery for a long time. Do you think so?
I'll go again. Well, I think France's problem with its migrant population in terms of violence is, I think, more unique to France insofar as its imperial history is particularly bloody, especially in Algeria. And so there is, I think, a latent imperialistic tendency there, which is still ongoing. When Britain has had what could be described as race riots in the last few decades, I'm thinking of the Tottenham riots in 2011, in Brixton in 1981, and in Oldham 2 decades ago. Those were different immigrant populations, all previously from the British Empire's kind of reach and heritage. But they weren't as severe as what we've seen in the last few weeks, I think in part because the level of animosity between the French population and the Algerian French population is severe. But also, the French state is particularly bad at how it assimilates migrants. On the economy, I think they're very tough on letting people who work once they arrive here. If they are going to let them in, they should let them work, okay? Otherwise, despondency creates a natural vacuum for violence and bad action. But also, housing is a major issue with the French state and migrants. We do not have such a problem in Britain, whereas in London you have recent migrant arrivals living in the centre of the city in social housing. This might be an issue for other reasons, but for assimilation and a feeling of a closeness to the country, that is generated quite automatically. 40% of renters in Britain are foreign-born, and lots of them are right there in the middle. Whereas in Paris, for example, the banlieue, everybody knows about the problem associated with the French migrant populations forcibly ghettoized by virtue of the housing system and the planning reform. So there are ways that France can atone for its past without self-hating and apologizing for its history. It could simply change some housing rules and loosen workers' rights.
Just to add, there's good details, and I just add a sort of abstracted sort of view of it. The thing is with migration, as with all these types of cultural issues these days, it's very polarized politically, and I think both sides have in their analysis have a tendency to fall in. I'm not saying you were doing this, but I'm saying that there's a tendency with the debate on either side of these sorts of debates around issues like integration in France or in the UK or indeed in the United States, and social justice issues in the United States are similar, where there's each side of the politics, I think, have a very simplistic caricature they fall into. And the way I express it is, the problem with the right is they have a tendency to assume that people are always victims of themselves and therefore they're feckless. But the problem with the left is they always think people are victims of others and therefore they're helpless. Now, both are actually a form of prejudice, because if you think someone is always a victim of themselves, you're saying basically it's their character that's wrong. But if you're always thinking they're a victim of someone else, then you're actually patronizing them and saying they have no agency, they have no free will, they cannot determine their own outcomes. And I think one of the big issues with these sorts of debates is that we tend to assume there must be a simple answer out there, that there must be something that we can identify called integration or migration, and if we can identify it, we can find a solution. The problem with social issues is they're not they're not billiard balls. There's not a causal model we can have of these things. It's always more complex, more contingent. There will always be compromises. Solution to social issues are never perfect. They're always based on everyone agreeing to accept a bit of failure. So I don't think these types of tensions will ever go away. It's not simply that we have tensions with immigrant communities. I mean, if you look at the history of British, you look at the UK, there's been class tensions for a long time. Or indeed across Europe, the entire of the sort of notion of communism was to do with class clashes. There's all types of different conflicts. Society is about being constantly trying to find acceptable compromises so that violence doesn't emerge between different communities. They can be ethnic, class, they can be migrant populations, and so on. So sometimes we fall into this idea that there is a perfect world out there where everything is wonderful, and I just don't think it's possible. But I think the one thing we can avoid, as a matter of just humility, is to avoid falling into simplistic analyses. And the most important thing is to understand the conditions somewhat on the ground. Yeah, and so the answer is that there'll be cultural elements. The state will have some things it can improve. We kind of try and just work it out, improve things a little bit here and there, and then obviously face the consequences of the solutions we found. That's what we do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with this. Although, again, as a very tiny pushback to this, because the comparison, for example, between, let's say, cultural issues or migration issues and class issues, I think that's a very good comparison. I think there are many, many similarities. But if we look at, let's say, in Europe, at least at the broader history, whether it was, Germany in the 19th century or Britain in the 19th century, there was an understanding that even despite class differences, that people understood themselves as being part of the same nation, as being part, quote unquote, of the same culture. I mean, Germany is a horrible but good example for this. I mean, the Social Democratic Party was banned, the Social Democratic Party or Social Democrats were suppressed, but once World War I broke out, it was absolutely clear where the German worker was standing. I mean, this was Marx's great mistake, right? The idea, he was not alive anymore at the time, but the idea was if the war breaks out, the workers in the trenches will basically unify and the classes will rise up, but it turned out that nationalism was a much stronger bond than class consciousness, which I think gives us a very good lesson, which is even nationalism in the sense is not racial or ethnical, right? In many ways it can be cultural. Look at the United States. There is no US ethnicity, so you can integrate people, whatever their backgrounds are. But I think you need to give them something to integrate into, right? It might be the proverbial American dream, and if, which is a fine decision politically, if Germany decides, if Austria decides, if France decides to become immigrant societies, which is fine, but then they need something that resembles the American dream as the French dream, the German dream, something where these newcomers can integrate into. So you cannot have it both ways, right? You cannot say we're a society that defines itself in ethnic terms, or if you want to use a harsher term, in blood terms, but we open our borders, because then people can never integrate because they can never be French. If you say, okay, being French is actually an idea, a commitment to certain values, it doesn't matter if your parents are from Morocco, Algeria, or somewhere else. And I think this is the thing. Absolutely agree. Culture is not everything. But at some point, these people must arrive, and we also, at least in some cases, know it's not the first generation or second generation immigrants very often where the main problems arise. It's third generation immigrants, people who speak perfectly the language, people who have a passport of these countries, and yet they feel alienated. And I fully agree with that. I think there's responsibility on both sides. This is not, oh, it's all their fault. But I think this is something we have to look at. How can these people become part of the societies within which they live? And there, I think we could do practical steps. Just to give you one example. School, right? If you have school classes, whether it's in Germany or France, where 75% of school children have a non-German speaking or non-French speaking background, it's going to be those 25 German or French speakers who are going to integrate with the rest and not the other way around. So you need those people, you need to distribute them, not just over Europe, you need to distribute them over the country. Because where do you have the most successful or very good track record in integration? In the countryside. Because if you're in a small Hungarian, Austrian, German village, and they're basically 70, 80% German, and there is 3, 4, 5 Syrian families or whatever it is, they have no choice but to integrate. Their kids will speak German. Their kids will become 1 or 2 generations down the road German. But if we allow parallel societies, if we allow ghettoization within the large cities, I think that's where the trouble then starts.
I'm very compelled by this rural example of assimilation, and I think it rather decimates the idea that we can define a nation by values and then expect migrants to become a part of it. I think you actually deal with your first idea with your second one, I think, because Britain has tried this in some way. We've, since the Blair era, come up with this idea that there is such thing as British values, which are described in very loose, kind of globalist terms of tolerance and diversity, when actually, Britain is a civilization of several millennia, and to define it as in kind of loose and abstract ways is not very helpful. And if you have sudden huge arrivals of migrants from stronger cultures than a few loose terms and values, they are more likely to refer back to those than the kind of wishy-washy flim-flam that you give them at school. That is more compelling. That is, I think, also more beautiful. I don't blame them for not assimilating if they have something cultural, religious, and foundational, and built into their family, built into their heritage to look back to, even if they're not there anymore. If you are from Uganda and you have family back home, you have a more compelling national story than tolerance, then yeah, you'd probably take that. And so I think, you know, the American system can work more effectively because it describes itself as a great experiment and as an idea, which it does through enormous riches, and that is beautiful and aspirational. But European civilizations are, I think, tougher to walk into in that way. Their modes of feeling and thought and their softer cultural expressions are gentler and more niche and require not force, but to be compelled to be taught. Language requirements, as you refer to, for example. I think this is a more compelling vision.
So the question arises, according to your view, of course, what can a state do to patrol an effective integration and assimilation process?
You go on, yeah.
Effective integration and assimilation process. Well, I think in general, I think there's some difficulties understanding what we mean by integration and assimilation. I don't want to sound like I'm being too abstracted and academic, but the truth is when we talk about integration, well, integration into what? What is the thing into which one is being integrated? If you ask what is it to be British, or indeed what is it to be Hungarian, you know, it's quite a difficult issue. We kind of know, but it's hard to describe, and if it's hard to describe, it's hard to build policy around that. And it's hard to build policy around that. How do you actually do anything proactively as a state or even as a community to do that? One of the issues I know in research around integration and assimilation issues is that people often think, well, they go to the communities and say, well, what is your community? But the people they will be speaking to are the community leaders, not the people who are not the leaders. And typically, if you go to, you know, like a Pakistani community, you'll speak to the men who are the leaders. You won't meet the women. So you get a very one-sided view as to what the society, that community wants. So there's all sorts of issues around who speaks for a community in terms of what it is to be integrated. And even with the question of integration, it's a difficulty to understand sometimes what we're trying to integrate into. And I think this, again, comes back to my point before, that with a lot of social issues, there's a lot of words we throw around, like integration or assimilation or justice or freedom or culture. But these are difficult terms. We use them in our ordinary language. But as soon as you translate ordinary language into policy, it is tricky. Even migration gets a bit tricky sometimes. What is a migrant? Do you have to stay a day, a week, a year? If you do, you know, where we draw the boundary around what we define as migration is inherently political. It's not sort of scientific. And so how do you build policy that isn't purely political? And if it is purely political, then obviously it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences. So it's just one of those nebulous issues. I don't really have an answer as to how you do it. But again, I think what there needs to be is more humility around the way we frame our problems and the assumptions we make about our ability to do things. There's one error running through all the way governments do things on these issues, is that they think ought implies can. But just because you think you ought to do something doesn't mean you can do it. And I don't think we're often conscious of that distinction.
I mean, if I would have to formulate something, there is one statistic, one number that always struck me. The first institution in the United States that really abandoned racial prejudice was the U.S. within the members of the institution, not from the legal framework, was the U.S. military. And the reason for this was because once white soldiers and black soldiers served in the same unit, right? Once they had significant interaction and had to do something with a member of another race, right? Prejudice dropped precipitously. And I think this is something we have to look at. I think if you want people to become part of a society, you need them to do stuff, to do things with other members of that society, right? Whether it be some form of, let's say, public service, whether it be a mandatory military service. I'm open for all kinds of things, but I think it creates then kind of new bonds of trust between the, if you want, the original or the host population and the newcomers, because a lot of it is just very often there is not a lot of interaction between those groups, right? I'm sure in France, not many people know someone who lives in the banlieues, and not many people in the banlieues know somebody who is not part of the banlieues. So if you could find ways for them to do something, and I'm not just talking about sitting them in a classroom together, let them do something together. And see, even if it's just small things like collecting trash or, you know, building a house, I don't know, whatever it is. But I mean, we have plenty of evidence from social psychology. If people start to do something together, right, it creates a bond, right? Common purpose creates also a sense then of common identity, common destiny is a strong term, but of a common final goal, right? And if people then interact, there will be some problems, but at some point they're gonna realize, right, wait, we're not that different after all. I mean, this has been for a long time, right? The best machinery of integration is interaction between families. The group of people that are usually the least prejudiced are small children. Right? If you ensure to get them together at a very early age, I think that could go a very, very long way to at least alleviate some of these problems. Again, if you are born in the banlieues, right, and you are 16 years old, and basically your social circle is all people, let's say, with an Algerian background. I mean, in what sense, except your passport and your language, are you French? You probably have, I'm exaggerating slightly, but you've probably never met a French person. So the French state says, assimilate, integrate. How? Like, because they don't know what into. But if they would find ways, again, kind of to break up these boundaries, right, to get these people to interact more, I think that would have a significant effect. I'm not sure if everybody would want to do this, so there would have to be a certain force from the government. National service, exactly. I think, I mean, you know, I'm in Austria has no impressive army, but we still have the draft. So I served in a military that probably would lose every war they would fight, but you still get the social benefits. And again, it can be a national, it can be something else. It doesn't have to be the military. But I think this idea of getting people together at an early age could go a long, long way.
Yeah, I think before we start putting a rifle in the hand of every person who turns up on a small boat in Britain, there are softer and subtler ways of achieving this, perhaps. Force is required, as you say, but attempts to use force to achieve assimilation have received significant pushback so far. Before the military comes into question, just the basic European expectation that you shake hands, this requirement is not enforced by the law, but it is a social expectation. And there is no shortage of problems whereby people refuse to get their citizenship because they refuse to shake the hand of the person offering it because they're a woman, for example, or they fail to meet that final criteria, that final show of fidelity towards the cultural expectations of the country that they are intending to join. That requires force at the real lowest level. And I think once you have forced communication and forced links between communities in this way, then I think that's better than, again, putting them all in uniform, which seems a little bit severe. I
agree. I mean, this was just one example, but
sorry,
no, it's fine. It's a cheap shot, but well made. But the idea in Europe, but we think about European history as a history of nations. But in many ways, those nations are also social constructs. In many ways, they were invented, right? I mean, Italy did not exist as a state until the late 1860s, the early 1870s. The French were actively using military service to create the French nation, right? It existed on a map, right? Those who could read and write, which at that, again, in the 18th, 19th century was also a minority, a smaller, shrinking one, but it was a minority, right? They were taught in school, you are part of the French nation. They were taught in the military, you are part of the French nation. So nation building from the top down as an elite project has been the very case in Europe. Now we perceive our nations as something, oh, I know the Hungarians are going to hate to hear this, but, you know, oh, Hungary has been around for 1,300 years. And we do the same in Austria. We say, you know, the name Austria was first mentioned in 996, and we say Austria is 1,000 years old. 1,000 years ago, nobody had a clue what Austria was. But we tell ourselves these stories, we tell ourselves, and they are great, I like them, right? I choose to believe them, but they are myth, and they play a very important role, and I don't believe that there is a genetic, racial, ethnic barrier to do this. I think you can, like, there are people in the United States today whose parents came from Sweden, from Israel, from all parts of the world, and they fully identify as Americans. They look at the founding fathers and say, that's my history, even though their parents had nothing to do with that history. I think it's possible for somebody to come from Turkey to Germany, from Syria to Austria, from Algeria to France, from Pakistan to Great Britain, and do the same thing and say, I might be genetically, right, biologically from the different part, but this is how I feel. And if we look as the last point on Great Britain, who are currently kind of the most, let's call it, if you will, patriotic, conservative individuals in the Tory party. It's all people with a migrant background. So even patriotism apparently is now more forcefully carried in some cases by people with a let's say, centuries-old British background because they choose to be British. So I think this is a possibility, and this is why I'm still hopeful that integration, at least to some extent, is a possibility.
Can I just ask something very quickly? That it is interesting with the British Conservative Party right now because a lot of the senior politicians, including the Prime Minister, are second, indeed sometimes first-generation immigrants. And it's something I find very interesting about the sort of progressive left view of migration issues and social justice issues is they presume anyone who's a minority or an immigrant agrees with them. But actually, any minority you meet who move to a country like Britain or the United States tend to be quite conservative. They're coming there because they want the rule of law and they want the meritocracy and all these types of things. And so it's an interesting sort of tension sometimes that the progressive left think that they are speaking for anyone who isn't basically sort of a middle-class white person in America or something. But actually, you meet anyone in the Chinese community who've just come from China or from the Middle East or really anywhere, they're often way more conservative on, obviously on lots of issues they are. And it's something that, it's one of the strange paradoxes of the politics of the Anglosphere.
I'm unconvinced by this. I don't think it's true. I'm sorry. I think that there are small examples we can pick out in British society with famous ministers, for example. But I think the broader social trends, as reflected by wider immigrant populations, don't show that they're more patriotic. They might be more socially conservative. London is the most socially conservative part of Britain, for example.
I wasn't saying patriotic, but I just meant in terms of just conservative, simply.
Conservative. I think this social conservatism, as expressed by migrant populations, might be useful on some social attitude surveys, and it usually reflects more of a kind of a personal intolerance towards some ways of life, but it doesn't translate into commitment to the nation or to the nationhood. It doesn't translate into anything, I think, more collective or natural to the English modes of feeling and thought. It's quite separate, I think, and I think a lot of people can hide behind the fact that when you have a big West African population in London, they are against gay marriage, therefore they're very socially conservative, and this is good for conservatism. But actually, I don't think these people broadly become conservatives in the bigger sense.
I get what you're saying, but I do think if you want to find someone who's absolutely not a patriot of Britain, go find a middle-class white person who went to Cambridge. Like it's, if you really want to find someone who's ready to run down the UK or run down America, it's someone with a degree in anthropology, I'm not saying I'm like that, but all my people in my course when I studied there are classic people who'd say, down with this imperial power and dissolve it from the inside. Sure. And I do think in the West we've faced in the last couple of decades, because there's been no external challenge, we've had nothing to bind us together, and so we've started to divide our community from within and find these sort of very indulgent, I mean, if you look at the left, I think it's just suffered ideological gentrification, basically, because it used to represent the interests of the working class and so on. Now it just represents middle-class sensibilities.
This comes to a broader lack of confidence, right, in our own civilization, and people no longer feel capable to defend what it means to be British. And I think this is linked to the NGO class and academics, as you refer to. People with a PhD in anthropology are less likely to say serve in the military or feel a great sense of pride in their national heritage. And I think that then translates into the migrant population being less likely to assimilate or feel a sense of pride at what they've joined.
I think that those points are correct. I would just add one thing. A huge problem is that in Western societies, right, the solution to every problem is throw more money at it. Right? So we can say the idea is, but then you need more social workers, you need more, more unemployment benefits, you need, this and this and this. When in fact, I think what you really, or kind of what is a key thing, people need purpose. They need a sense of purpose, and I think this is something where we would have to find steps to give it to the people. The question is, as you correctly say, right? If you migrate to a country, and you don't have permission to work, right? You're basically stuck into a system where you get just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive, right? I have full understanding, right, that these people then probably make choices that generally then we connect to the problems with immigration and integration. And I think this is something that also needs to be broken through, right? Say, okay, we need to give these people either work permits, especially, and this is also a big lie, right, like in Germany and other places. We know that many of those people that come into the country and it said, oh, you have your claims, we're going to look at it, you have your day in court, and then you stay or you leave. 90% of these people stay. They never leave. But they don't get a work permit because potentially they're going to leave the next day. So we keep these people in limbo and then expect them to become German. Well, if you don't open the venue for them, how are they supposed to do it? And this is kind of, always kind of, at least the direction which I would like this problem to go, to say, listen, if we have people here where we know that they're not going to go anywhere, we have to do whatever we can in our power, not just to and this is another like European problem. We always manage problems, but we don't solve them, right? We try to kick the can down the road, and I think that's one of the big mistakes.
Speaking about another aspect of migration, we saw that migration also appeared as a hybrid weapon when Lukashenko put pressure on Eastern European borders. Should we be afraid that migration will be used as a weapon in the near future again, in other aspects also maybe?
Well, it's a very interesting topic. You may have all heard, be aware, of course, that the Lukashenko took a lot of Kurds actually from Iraq and gave them visas, brought them to Belarus, put them into unguarded camps on the border when the weather was getting colder, and said, look after yourselves. So it put pressure on the borders, and within the European Union there was a sense that we need to, obviously there's an obligation to protect people doing that, but also we don't want all these immigrants coming in who are being weaponized, right? But what's interesting about this story is that people were acting as if this is a new phenomena. But actually that's happened at least 81 times before in the last century. So for instance, in the 1970s, when India and Pakistan had one of their bouts of fisticuffs, the East Pakistan sent 10 million refugees across the border into India. In the 1980s or 70s and 80s, East Germany was flying in people from the Middle East and from South Asia on visas and saying, oh, now you can, we'll help you get into West Germany. And so this is a tactic that's really as old as, I suppose, nation-state politics, or at least the last century of it, maybe post-colonial politics. So it's not a new phenomena, but I do think Lukashenko made it sort of sexy again to some people. But the reason it's actually quite an interesting tactic is that it's very effective. Like in 3/4 of cases, whatever the state sending migrants demands, they get some of their demands met. It's basically like holding someone for ransom. It's exactly like that, really. And actually, in I think half the cases, they got all of their demands. Now, the demand may be they want certain concessions on something, or it may simply be to destabilize their neighbors. So in 3/4 of the cases, they achieve at least they achieve at least half of their objectives, which is very interesting as a tactic. So I think, yeah, we'll see a lot more of this now that it's become fashionable or aware that it's an option.
Very quickly, I mean, I just think that the Lukashenko example is interesting, but I think the more effective one of the last decade or so was Erdogan in Turkey, the threat to Europe with refugees from Syria, for example. He said, you know, if you don't oblige my demands, I will let 3.6 million people into the rest of Europe, and this worked. And this is one of the 3/4 examples I think you referred to, and he played it again and again. And I think in 2019 he kept using this threat, and it brought Europeans to the table. I mean, quite. Perhaps quite ironically, many of the European politicians sent from Brussels to negotiate with Mr. Erdogan were just, ranting and raving in the last decade about how wonderful migration was and how we need to take in as many people as possible, but then immediately described the possibility of 3 million arrivals as a threat and a crisis and a weapon that needed to be dealt with. I think it's some degree of cognitive dissonance there among the Europeans. But yes, as you say, it absolutely works, and I think, to answer the question, will we see more of it in the future? Absolutely, especially as the war rages on in the east of Europe.
So, how do you see Italy and Meloni's role in today's migration debate? Let's just talk about it. As Italy votes on the quota decision in the Council, Giorgia Meloni starts the Rome process, at the first summit of which she talks about the need for legal migration and wants to be a catalyst for cooperation between the EU and key states of North Africa. And meanwhile, her party is talking about the Georgia model, apparently trying to suggest the image of the great female politician of the era. What can the emphasis on the migration issue bring to Meloni? What do you think?
Well, I think what's interesting with that case is that there's always a point where the rhetoric and the political platform encounters reality, and reality is quite stubborn. And the truth is, with Italy, it's facing labor shortages, which they need to fill, but obviously her platform was to say, well, we've got to stop the irregular or illegal migration. And so she's actually, if you look at the policies she's endorsing now, I think it's the Rome Treaty, Rome Agreement. What Italy's trying to do is deal with the so-called root causes of migration, so poverty, apparently climate change, to try and lessen the amount of irregular migration. But they also need labor migration coming into the country. And this is kind of the issue, again, to come back to the pull back and look at the broader issue of the politics of migration, is the problem with the left's view of migration issues is that they say, well, the economic, it's part of the business cycle, it's good for the economy to have labor coming in and so on, but they pay no attention, scant attention to the cultural impact of change. But the problem with the right, they say, well, we're really concerned about the cultural impact, but what do you do about a labor shortage? And the issues I think, are much deeper because, as I mentioned earlier, we live in a society where the central imperative of our societies is economic growth. And that wasn't the case until 200 years ago. Just to put it in perspective, Europe grew 82% between the year 1000 and 1500, the 16th century. That's the same amount that China grew between 2002 and 2008. The point I'm making is that this notion of constant growth and change as the imperative is quite a recent cultural phenomena, the last couple hundred years, particularly since industrialization and so on. But if so, our economies, you think, are failing unless it's bigger than the year before. That never used to be the way we organize ourselves. It's quite a modern phenomena. The way we sustain that for the last century and a half has been taking our populations from, in the UK, 8 or 9 million, 10 million, I think it was in 1800, to 65, 70 million now. Yeah, and most of that was obviously homegrown. It was people born of people in the UK. But so if your entire model is based around growth and populations have tailed off because of when societies become wealthier, the birth rate drops and so on, then how do you sustain that? And there's no clear answer to what that is. And I think this is what people like Meloni are now facing, is that obviously there's the very compelling politics of let's keep Italy Italian, which I think anyone in any part of the world will feel about their own community. There's nothing wrong with that sentiment. But at the same time, there is this reality. We live in a sort of political economy where the central imperative is this forward momentum, but at what cost? And I don't have any solutions to that, but I think that there is that's the tension. I mean, the human condition is full of nothing if not paradoxes, but the collective human condition in the world we live in now is absolutely subject to these sorts of paradoxes. And this is why I think sometimes the way that I think it's too polarized is not helpful, because I think both sides fall into simplicity and a failure to acknowledge the realities of the world we live in and the realities of the communities that we love.
Yeah, I tend to agree with this. I would just maybe add a 1 or 2 points. One is I agree with the argument about growth, but of course I think we also have to look at the fact that we have been growing economically in terms of output, but we actually have shrinking the amount of work that we put in to do it. I mean, in Austria, I'm sure it's the same in other countries, we have a 5 weeks paid vacation, a 37.5 work week. We have, I think, 13 public holidays in addition to the paid vacation. So Austrians work significantly less than they did 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, but they're economically much better off. We have an incredible rise in part-time work. So this is another issue, and the labor shortages, unfortunately, are not filled by the kind of migration or the bulk of the migration that Europe is currently experiencing. And I believe that a lot of these shortages could be filled, right, if you tweak the welfare state. Whether it's with mandatory work, whether it's with, like the Danish, for example, try to do, whether the flex security system, where if you don't take a job, kind of the longer you don't take on a job, despite you having opportunities, your welfare payment goes down. So I think we have simply created a state that has baked into the cake a labor shortage, because in many ways it's not necessary to work full-time at least. So I think there could be solutions to these economic problems that would not necessarily entail more immigration. And then, of course, the other point is, as always, what kind of immigration? Germany, again, I'm sorry for talking so much about Germany, but they have a huge lack of skilled labor, because the skilled laborers in Germany, because of bureaucracy and high taxes, leave Germany. Now the German ministers are flying to Brazil and try to convince skilled laborers from Brazil to come to Germany. But the promise that was made that, for example, refugees from Afghanistan or Syria will fill these positions, that they will be the skilled labor that they're lacking, it simply did not materialize. Again, I'm sure it was well intended, but it simply, unfortunately, did not materialize.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a case, and Meloni is a fine example of this, whereby a politician campaigns very strongly on a staunch conservative background. They campaign enormously effectively, and then as soon as they get into power, as Calum says, they encounter reality. And their message shifts into one of a more middle ground approach to dealing with many of these issues. And Calum spoke about the imperative for economic growth. I mean, Italy desperately needs that. It has economically flatlined for somehow even longer than Britain. It's approaching 3 decades of economic stagnation. And if, as I'm sure many Italian business groups are convinced that migration is the solution to this, and Meloni has, I think, now committed to 400,000 new migrants, majority from third world or less developed countries over 3 years, then the system should change to reduce that cultural impact. And I think Europe is way too insular in how it deals with this problem. It looks to other European countries for solutions and doesn't find them. And I think Europeans should now look to the Middle East and look at the strategies that successful growing economies have done there with what is known as the kafala system, whereby workers can come and reap the rewards of working in a richer nation for 4 years or so, and then return home and return back to their culture and their country. So both parties win, and the host nation gets to control a greater sense of the migrant flow. I think this is an ideal solution.
Can I just throw in as well that, I mean, during the economic crisis in 2008 in England, even when people were losing their jobs, they actually were struggling to fill a lot of roles, say in London. And these jobs are sometimes described as the 3 Ds, dirty, demeaning, and dangerous jobs. And actually immigrants would fill the roles, but native Brits would not fill those roles, would not take on those roles, even if the job was available and they needed a job. And so that was one issue. But the other is that, and there's a great English journalist now dead called A.A. Gill, who was this wonderful writer. And he wrote this brilliant piece that should be a set text in every school on old age. And it's on the way we treat old people in the UK. And he made a really interesting observation, so he stayed with me. He said there's a reason why our care homes are staffed by people who are from cultures that venerate age more than we do. Because all the people who work at the care homes are from the Philippines and so on, but because there were still communities that actually saw old age as something to venerate. Whereas for us, we were so terrified of getting old that we shift all of our parents out into nursing homes, which is inconceivable in some of these cultures. And it was an interesting observation that I think in the UK, as an example, we've had that there are a lot of roles that native Brits don't want to fill. There's a lot of cultural norms we have, like sending people to care homes, where we need to have someone fill those jobs. And the best people we can find are, say, from the Philippines.
I think the reason why so many care homes are filled with migrant workers isn't necessarily just because of the cultural veneration, but also we have a domestic cap on the number of care workers that we train, and nurses, for example, and these jobs pay very poorly. It's not just that they're dangerous, dirty, and demeaning. The reason why the native workers don't often do these jobs is because the pay isn't good enough, because they're crowded out and the supply of migrant work forces the conditions and the pay further and further into the floor. So if you remove the model that exists as it stands or tweak it significantly to reduce the competition that native workers face with migrants, particularly from countries with significantly worse workers' rights, then I think you'd find that shift. I mean, I think people are way too keen to denigrate the capacity for toil in kind of the European or the English native worker. They will do hard work, significantly hard work, if the pay is there. And at the moment, it just isn't.
There's another yet interesting example how a European country try to solve migration issues. The British government is looking for new ways to curb migration. Instead of the forbidden yet frequent pushbacks and the tenuous protests of deportation, they would organize the evaluation of applications in Rwanda. What do you think of this process, this aspect of curbing migration? And what effect could it have on the British government and the British society, of course?
I think I'll start on this. But it's going very badly. Our attempt to deal with our illegal migration problem is to say it is a disaster is true is a grave understatement. There are many reasons why this is going on. So we have a legal crisis at play here. We're a member of the European Convention of Human Rights, which restricts us to carrying out the strategy that Parliament has voted for. But also, we are signed up to this 1951 UN Convention on Asylum, which was designed with good intentions in mind, with the Second World War and the horrors of that era at the forefront of the political imagination. It is now being used to grant asylum to Albanian men who are coming over as economic migrants claiming that they have got some problem back home and asylum processes are pushed through. But the numbers are so severe now, and the law is so bad that this is a really disastrous situation. Attempts to deal with it that have been going on recently are almost comical. I mean, they've bought some barges, huge boats that we would use to store oil and gas workers, parked them in the south coast of England, and they've become migrant hotels. Normal hotels to the tune of nearly £8 million a day are being booked out by the Home Office, our Home Ministry, to store asylum seekers or just economic migrants while they process their often bogus asylum claims. And in the last 2 days, there was some noise coming out of the Home Office that they're going to set up tent cities for migrants, like you might see in Jordan dealing with the Syrian crisis. So it's becoming a comedy of errors as we continue to wrestle with this crisis. The solution is legalistic. I mean, we left the European Union and Parliament is now sovereign in Britain. If we want to change the law and to carry out the will of the people and what we want to achieve to deal with migration, we can. But there's a lack of capacity to do this for reasons quite unknown. And so the fast will continue. There were 8,000 people crossing by small boats a few years ago. There were 46,000 last year. 1,500 have arrived since Tuesday. It's likely that the record will be broken this year. If we want to change this system, change the law, enact the Rwanda plan, and watch the incentives disappear overnight.
I mean, I think the central question is in the context of Britain's Rwanda policy, will they end up leaving, the European Convention on Human Rights? And that's really the central question. I think if Labour were in power, I don't think they would. Keir Starmer would stay. But I also don't think Rishi Sunak would, because Rishi Sunak is a technocrat. He's not an ideologue. He's going to play it safe because he's definitely, among other things, has an eye on afterwards being able to go to the right dinner parties with the people who have the most sort of polite conversation, and he doesn't want to be excluded from that. So Rishi Sunak is refreshing to have someone who's not quite as sort of chaotic as Johnson, but he's kind of boring for a reason because he's not going to risk anything. So I think he'll talk about the rhetoric of being upset with the convention, but I don't think he's going to leave. But I do think there's a deeper thing in this, which is that the very fact it's being discussed that the UK may leave the convention in light of this really shows you how rickety and how tired all these post-World War II conventions are. There's a Latin word which I'll now mispronounce, which is the saeclium, or cyclium maybe, and it's where the word century is derived from, and it means the course of human memory, so 80 years. And if you look at history, it often runs in these sort of 80-year cycles. And it's very interesting, we've been living in this sort of post-war saeclium, where a lot of the institutions, the art, the culture, the films we watch, the comic books kids read, everything, it's all stuff that's post-World War II. And we kind of feel, if you look across the culture from the institutions to the art forms, the music forms, everything, it's all feeling a bit tired, a bit done. We've gone recently to the sort of the ironic engagement with these things. A lot of them have been hollowed out. Look at the UN. The UN doesn't do much of what it used to do. But actually it's now, and indeed the EU is changed from an economic to a political project. And that political project is, a lot of people have become preoccupied with issues now, which I think are, which you would never have thought we'd be talking about 30 years ago. Like especially around cultural war issues and so on. So I do feel like a lot of the old 20th century post-war institutions are running to the end of their life cycle. And so I do think the fact it's even being talked about that we might leave reflects a broader sea change in the culture, which we can all see around us, that we're going to come to some sort of point where something happens, quite dramatic, and then the world will be made anew in some way with new ways of organizing ourselves. So I don't think either will leave, but I think these types of institutions will probably start to dissolve over the next 10 years anyway.
So unfortunately, our time is up for today's panel discussion, but I would like to thank you all for your attention and, of course, you for sharing your valuable thoughts with us today. Thank you all.
Köszönöm szépen.
Some slides, this is good.